Alright, so you've got your favorite Lululemon shorts on, laced up your brand new Reebok Nanos, chugged your pre-workout, and blasted your hype playlist through your Beats headphones as you stampede into the gym like a jungle cat ready to feast on those caribou-like dumbbells. Now what? Do you slap 315 on the bar and go for max reps because a lion doesn't stretch before it eats its prey? Wrong. You stretch because an injured lion starves to death. On today's episode, we're going to discuss the benefits of a dynamic warm-up and why it's better for you than static stretching. This is Coach's Corner. Alright, so I already made a video on static stretching. If you haven't watched that, go watch that prior to seeing this video. Today I'm going to focus on the differences between dynamic and static stretching, the benefits of a dynamic warm-up for performance, and then I'll show you what I do for my own kind of pre-workout stretching routine. All right, so the main differences between dynamic and static stretching. The dynamic stretching, if I were to define it, it would be mainly active movements exceeding comfortable limits, similar to the required positions for whatever sport or activity you're stretching to participate in. Typically, it is slow and controlled movements. It's not fast and ballistic. It works on multiple systems or multiple structures or multiple levels, such as the joint capsule, the muscles, the nervous system via increased proprioceptive input, which proprioception is your body's awareness of space. It typically uses mechanoreceptors. Increase in tissue temperature and increased blood flow to the muscles. And its purpose is to enhance the performance, not necessarily relieve a painful muscle. Whereas static stretching, like I said, we already talked about this, but I'll mention some points, is to primarily is, you're holding a position at the position of restriction. Its purpose is primarily to increase the flexibility of soft tissues through mechanical lengthening and inhibition of muscle spindles. Usually you're using longer durations. It's needed for what we call tissue creep. The stretches are typically done for 2 minutes or greater duration. And so those are the main differences between static and dynamic stretching. Next, we're going to kind of talk about the different examples of dynamic stretching. Dynamic stretching is a much broader term than static stretching just because there are many different variables involved and techniques used. So some examples for dynamic stretching would include some concepts from the FRC, train of thought, which stands for functional range conditioning. I went to that class and they talked about a couple of different concepts. The first one is the acronym CARS, which stands for Controlled Articular Rotations. So these are basically just active range of motion through the end range of all available planes for a specific joint or region. The next concept is the acronym PAILS and RAILS, which stand for Progressive and Regressive Angular Isometric Loading. So these are essentially a PNF style contract, relax, antagonist, contract method of stretching at the end range of a muscle or joint position. Next is just the whole broad concept of PNF type stretching, which PNF stands for proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. This is basically a combination of active and passive stretching that uses muscle contractions of opposing muscle groups to reduce or inhibit neurologic tone of a muscle. Then the last concept, this one is the concept of like movement flows. This is kind of trendy on social media nowadays. You'll see people just post something that looks choreographed, moving from one movement, flowing into the next one. But this is also very similar to what we have been traditionally doing in our dynamic warm-ups for the past, couple decades. And it just involves, either staying in one place or across a set distance, basically, like I said, transitioning from one movement pattern to another and just repeating that process. All right, so for the benefits of dynamic stretching, There's overwhelming evidence that shows that dynamic stretching is superior to static stretching before athletic performance specifically. Static stretching is associated with what we call the stretching-induced force deficit, which is thought to be caused by decreased reflex sensitivity of the muscle spindles and decreased tissue stiffness affecting the length tension curve of the muscle. Conversely, dynamic stretching increases muscle activity through post-activation potentiation, which allows for increased force production, such as MVC, which is maximal voluntary contraction. That's typically done in a lab setting. 1 repetition max, vertical jump height, sprinting, and different balance tasks. Because of the increased proprioceptive input from dynamic stretching, it's also superior to just doing some light aerobic work, such as like 5 minutes on a stationary bike, prior to any training. And then the last point, which I'll touch briefly on, is the ability of dynamic stretching or dynamic warm-ups to reduce injuries in training, which has been shown for programs, such as the FIFA 11 Plus with like knee or ACL type injuries. Basically the take-home message is that if you prepare the tissue for the task at hand, it'll perform better and you're less likely to get injured. And it's free. Stretching doesn't, require any fancy equipment. You just go out and stretch. Grab a little space, do a stretching routine. You need the knowledge to understand which ones you should be doing, but stretching in itself is a free intervention that we can do. So that's always great to advocate for. That's pretty much it for the overview on dynamic stretching. What I want to do now is kind of take you over to my kind of personal stretching routine. Keep in mind this is just what I do before any of my strength and conditioning workouts. I don't train for a particular sport, so these movements may not cross over if you're training for a particular sport or for a particular competition. This is just what I do before my strength and conditioning workouts. So hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll see you guys in the next video.